Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you very much, Andy, for giving me this opportunity to say something about a book that has meant a lot to me ever since I was about 15 years old. This book, as well as Nehru's The Discovery of India, that these two books shaped me seminally in a way that I don't think any other single works have. And I guess what I'm really talking about here is a very personal thing. My personal reading of this particular aspect of the book, and I will not belabor you with any theoretical complexities, but I hope this will be interesting because I got a particular take on this. First of all, I want to read a few quotes for you. The first one is the correspondence between CLR and one of his great friends, a man named Jack Fingleton, who played in the Bodyline series and was the number 5 or number 6 batsman with Bradman and Bill Woodfull and Bertie Oldfield and all these great players from the 1930s. And he had become a very famous journalist, cricket journalist. And CLR had sent the manuscript to him up to the end of chapter 17. And he was returning the manuscript because he couldn't find a publisher in Australia for this book. On the 2nd of March, 1961, addressed to CLR James, San Juan, Trinidad. I've been very impressed with it. Unfortunately, I can't find a publisher. But he's now suggesting to CLR that he should do a chapter on the recently concluded West Indies tour of Australia in 1960-61. Of course, you know the CLR made the single most important contribution to the selection of Worrell as the captain on that tour of 60-61. And this is what he says. You should have no great difficulty in securing a publisher. You will now be able to add a final chapter that is on the tour. And I think that will round the book off. The classical success of Worrell. By the way, they just lost the series 2-1 to Australia. Not only as a captain and a team man, but as a diplomat. His team was a credit. It was a grand tour. Grand tour. The West Indies certainly should never have lost. Well, they didn't quite lose. Some of the decisions went against them at crucial times. And its effects will be felt in this country for years. Please give my best wishes to Leary. Leary, of course, was the great Leary Constantine and a great friend of CLR James. So, in speaking of James and this captaincy and what I see as the legacy of it, I'm talking primarily of two men here, CLR James and the relationship with Leary Constantine, because I think that is fundamental to it. People have referred to this relationship, the various clubs. James, of course, as you recall from Beyond the Boundary, did not go to Shannon, which is the club that, by virtue of his race, by virtue of his class position as belonging to the lower middle class, he should have gone to Shannon. Instead, as he said, he went light, okay? He went light because people said, man, these are the people you're going to meet in future life. These are the people who are important in the society. It's good to get to know them. So he went to Maple. But I'm just going to quote here now from Beyond the Boundary, where he's talking about this book. And this is what he says. He says, the old Shannon Club, that's the club of Leary Constantine, LeBrun Constantine, his father, the St. Hill brothers, all three of them, Wilton, Cyril, Eric. The old Shannon Club of those days, that's the 1920s, early 1930s, is a foundation pillar of this book. That's a very big statement to make. And all of Constantine's fierce and sustained attacks against the way West Indian cricket is managed stem from his Shannon experience, which is also the foundation pillar of this book, or a foundation pillar of this book. Constantine believes that the real West Indies team should be a team that would play with the spirit and fire, the spontaneous self-discipline and cohesion of Shannon. With such a West Indies side, Constantine would throw down the gauntlet without fear to a world 11 of Graces, Bradmans, Ranjit Singhis, Spofforts, O'Reilly, and so on. That's a very big statement to make. And then another quote taken from Constantine's book, Cricket and I, which CLR helped him to write. And this is Constantine speaking. And he's talking here about his father, Le Brun Constantine, the first black man to represent any side, any of the island side or territorial sides or colonial sides in the West Indies as early as 1893, when he represented Trinidad, at a time when Demerara or British Guyana would not have picked a black man, at a time when Barbados also would not have picked a black man, but at a time when Trinidad, a pioneer in this area, not only proceeded to pick a black man, but made it possible for the first West Indies team that came to England in 1900 to include something like 6 or 7 black men, most of whom at one point, if they were not from Trinidad, had gone to Trinidad because they saw Trinidad as a place with opportunities. I shan't go into the historical reasons for this, but there are a number of reasons why this is the case. But I'm talking here about what he calls the foundation, a foundation pillar of this book. And he's saying, let Constantine speak here, from Cricket and I of 1933. And Constantine is talking about Le Brun, his father. You were not allowed to miss anything. If one ball got away from you and then another, it was as well as if you were far from him. For if you were near, he would give you a rap on the head. Sheer carelessness, which to him was unforgivable sin. Often he put us to stand just a few feet behind his back and hit the catches over his shoulder while we caught them behind. With his strong wrists and forearms, he would hit fairly hard in any direction. They were awkward to judge, but that was not accepted as an excuse for missing. My father's theory being simplicity itself. If you are paying attention, you do not miss. Pay attention. Pay attention again, you'd say. To this day, I pay attention, and when I don't, my side suffers. Now, I think this gives you an idea here of what this Shannon team meant in Trinidad. This morning, I think when Neil was speaking, he referred to George John, who was one of the great West Indian fast bowlers, one of the, in a way, foundation stone of West Indian fast bowling. And he was saying that he was not considered a representative man. He was a great fast bowler and a fearsome fast bowler who by the time he came here, England rather, by the time he came to England in 1923, he was past his best. But he was a ferocious fast bowler. I think James said that, they would have called him Furioso or something at another time. The point is that this man here, would not have been considered a representative man. That is, the black masses of Trinidad would consider somebody like Larry Constantine or somebody like Wilton St. Hill, whom James writes great length in Beyond the Boundary, as representative men. They played for Shannon. They represented Shannonism. But this guy, George John, although he was a great fast bowler, as James said, he came from one of the most backward of backward islands. I presume by that he meant he came from somewhere, St. Vincent or Grenada or somewhere, right? But apart from that, he was kind of sub-working class. He belonged to Stingo. Even the name suggests something, a kind of, an onomatopoeic kind of negative thing. I don't know why it was called Stingo. And James said, remember when he said when the choice came, should I go to one of these clubs? He said, I would not even have considered that. My people would not have even, I would have been discarded. I would have become an untouchable, a chamar or something, if I had gone there, if I had gone to Stingo. So this guy, although he was gifted, very talented, one of the great fast bowlers, and I think Larry himself was greatly impressed by this man and his whole approach, he did not speak at the core of black ambition in Trinidad. They would not have gone to Maple, James's club, because Maple was too light. They would not have identified with that. They would not identify with Stingo because Stingo was too low. But they could identify with Shannon because Shannon epitomized and Shannon represented what was seen as that vital force which had come into existence and which had been activated and inspired and accelerated, I think, by Garveyism in the 1920s and certainly reached a new dimension in the 1930s, certainly the latter part of the 1930s during the Great Labor Rebellion throughout the region, by which time even people in Stingo, some of them were playing for the West Indies. But what I'm saying is that these guys could not have been representative men because they did not speak to that groundswell of power which was now emerging within the Trinidad black working class, people working in the oil fields and so, who in a way were more proletarianized. They were not the lowest of the low, therefore those aspirations would have been more congruent with the kind of play that was associated with the lower middle class that was Shannon and Shannonism. And what did James mean by Shannonism? Shannon, the club of the Constantines and the St. Hill families, three of them, the Shannon Club played with a spirit and relentlessness, and they were supported by the crowd with a jealous enthusiasm, which even then showed the social passions which were using cricket as a medium of expression. It was not mere skill. They played as if their club represented the great mass of black people in the island. That's the crux of it. They played as if their club represented the great mass of black people in the island. They did, and they knew that. And that was what drove them on. That is what gave people like Constantine the kind of drive to achieve. And of course, Constantine would come to this country, the other one, would come to England and make such a great impression in the Lancashire League from 1920 to 1938. So that is the foundation. Now, Constantine was constantly emphasizing that, look, the time has come, we are good enough, man by man, they're no better than we. Something that James quotes in the book. They're no better than we. Constantine had no doubts at all that there were enough black players with the capacity for leadership in the West Indies. And that as early as the 1930s, as he narrated to James in Cricket and I, he was saying that we have got the ability to take on any team in the world and to win. We've also got the ability within the black community, among black cricketers, to lead this team and to lead this team to victory. And that was a big claim. And this was as early as the 1930s, 1933. I should point out that in 1935, when England toured the West Indies, that was only 7 years after West Indies had been given test status. The West Indies won the series 2-1, I think, in the final match played in Kingston, Jamaica. And for the latter part of that game, that's the prelude to the victory in that test and the victory in the series, the captain, Jack Grant, who was a white Trinidadian from a very distinguished missionary first, and then, Canadian mission who'd gone to work among the Indians there, a missionary family as well as a business family, the Grants. So this man, Jack Grant, was injured, and it was Larry who took over the captaincy of that team in the last day and a half or so when that victory, that famous victory, was won. So you could see that what Larry was saying here was, look, these guys who are selected only because they're white don't know us, they don't associate with us, they live in a different universe. Apart from that, man for man in terms of cricket, understanding of the technicalities of the game and the spirit of the game and all those kinds of things that Mike talked about this morning, about leadership qualities and so on. He was saying that all those things were already there, and that what was happening, the society which was now in rebellion really, challenging many aspects of colonial rule and the legacy of colonialism, that this game, which was at the very fount, I wrote a book some years ago called Muscular Learning, Cricket and Education in the Making of the British West Indies at the end of the 19th century, and the book stopped at 1900. I didn't go beyond 1900. But what was happening there already was that the colored middle class and the black middle class had already identified education and cricket as instruments of social mobility. And this was what was already happening there. That, James didn't come out of thin air. In that book, I talk about the influence of people like Blyden. I talk about the influence of people like Dr. T.E.S. Scholes, people like Dr. Robert Love, people like Dr. Albert Thorne, Sylvester Williams, and all these people who were already with the benefit of Western education, and they demonstrated they were as bright as anybody, intellectually as bright as anybody. They were beginning to look and re-examine their own background, their own history, their own race, the achievements of their people on the African continent and all of that. And that's what I'm saying, that this was the foundation stone. And this was what Constantine and Shannonism represent. So what James was really doing, James was now taking what was really the heart, the foundation of that society, which was beginning to challenge the assumptions of colonialism, this society in which people were beginning to say, we are capable of governing ourselves, you see? And as James always points out, he said, look, you had no great indigenous civilization through which Western civilization had to be permeated before you arrive at a definition of self. He was saying that black people there were already defining themselves in a way. They were not looking over their shoulders or making any apologies. They were saying, look, there are many positive things about this colonial experience. We can use this now to begin to fight our battles and to carry on our struggles. So this is where we come, and that is why by the time we get to the 1950s, James was in America until 1953. But once he got back to England in 1953, and shortly afterwards he started to write again for the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian as it still was. He was, you could see why he was now in a position to begin to look at that whole West Indian background. There was a lot of talk now about independence, self-government, whatever you want to call it. There was also talk now more and more about the West Indies Federation. And James was totally committed to the idea of West Indies Federation. Certainly initially among the English-speaking colonies, the British West Indies, but eventually he had a broader conception incorporating Haiti and Cuba and so on. What I'm saying is that this team, this West Indies team, from all these disparate places, had now come to represent, to epitomize this idea of the West Indian nation to which James was totally committed. And he felt that in people from the lower black middle class like himself, people like Clyde Walcott, the great Barbadian batsman, people like Frank Worrell, they were people of like minds, people from his own background. Don't forget, this morning again, Mike was talking about Josh Rudder. Josh Rudder came from Barbados, and there were so many skilled Trinidadians, or the families in that lower middle class, black families. If you examine where their roots came from, you will see George Padmore, all these people, they have some Barbadian connection. And that is why I'm saying that for James, there was no question. And once he got back to Trinidad for the first time in 26 years, when he got there, and he and Selma got there in 1958, and took over the P&M Weekly, changed the name, and created what, to my mind, was the greatest paper in the English language that I have seen for that short period when CLR and Selma were involved with editing of it. And that became the instrument that James used to make the case now for Worrell to be made the captain. So this tour, Frank became the captain in 60-61, and although they lost the series 2-1, they made such a great impression that people like Richie Beno, people like Jack Fingleton, people like Bradman himself felt that James was vindicated. There's no question that this team had not only done well, although they lost the series very closely. They were very closely played tests, including the first one, which ended in a tie in Brisbane in December 1960, that when they were leaving on the 17th of February, 1961, between 250,000 and 300,000 people came out in a city of less than 2-point-something million, came out in Melbourne to say goodbye to this great team. And I just want to read something very briefly here. First, of what John Arlott, another one of CLR's great friends and great supporters, I should point out when you read some of the correspondence between CLR and John always say, I'll have a good bottle of red if you can come by so-and-so, you know. But this is what he wrote when Worrell died in 67, John Arlott, in the Times of 1967. He says, Worrell's captaincy was outstanding, sharp in tactical perception, astute in attack and defense, quietly spoken, yet firm to the brink of ruthlessness. He outwitted his opponents and sustained his colleagues. As late as 1957, a West Indies team had crumpled psychologically in face of defeat. Now, at one crisis after another, Worrell, with what sometimes seemed like exaggerated calm, you know, no native with histrionics and showing all you wearing emotional on your shoulders and that kind of thing, with exaggerated calm, held them steady. His achievement may best be described as instilling in his players a professional attitude and stability which has endured. I'll go back to what Mike was talking this morning. And I'm going to close here with one final quote from Dean of Melbourne, the St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, because I think this is the final legacy here of the Worrell captaincy. And I want you to listen to this, please, because I think that this here is, for me, this is the ultimate thing. The Dean of Melbourne speaking in his cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral, shortly after 2 days after the West Indies left in February of 1961 after that great tour around the world. It was a sobering and humbling thought that the West Indians, whom Australia welcomed as cricketers, would not be welcomed as citizens, the Dean of Melbourne said yesterday. They welcomed them as cricketers, but they would not have welcomed them as citizens. Quote, their skin is the wrong color. They may play with us, but they may not stay with us. That is the anomalous situation in which we find ourselves as a result of our present migration policies. Although a number of them are university graduates, and many, World himself was a graduate from Manchester, and many of them members of our church, Anglicans, they are excluded from permanent residence by the policies we pursue. It may be that the game of cricket may yet pave the way for more generous national policies. If only we could cultivate the spirit of cricket, as played by the West Indians, in all our dealings, one with the other. It is not far from the spirit of Christ, and he hoped that this tour would lead to an opening up of Australia's immigration policies. Well, we know today, you go into cities like Melbourne and you go into Sydney, you could be anywhere in London or Birmingham, that sort of thing. So I think that this is it. The CLR felt vindicated, and he proceeded to write those final chapters, which he captioned generally Vox Populi, the people have spoken. Well, you could imagine how he felt, that his great friend, Frank Worrell, had spoken for the people of the West Indies, whatever the color of their skins. And I think that's the ultimate legacy of James, as well as Frank, and this great West Indies team of the 1960s. I thank you.
I thought I would begin my presentation by quoting Hobsbawm on a piece that said, there are no people without a history or who can be understood without a history, etc., and can't be understood without a history. But this morning I heard a very marvelous paper, which I think illuminated some of the things I was sort of talking about, which occurred to me. And it comes from the paper that was offered this morning by Brian Allen. And I think that's what I really wanted to say. I really want to offer, even though I think Bobby offers one narrative, one reading of the text, I want to offer another reading of the text. And I think it was illuminated by the marvelous paper delivered by Brian Allen, which he ends, talks about different forms of narrative and the use of the narrative structure to express the sense of self. I mean, James would have said this before, he's talking about autobiography, autobiography, bringing the self to life through graphy or writing. And what Brian says, I think, very wonderfully, and just quote him very briefly, I'll leave Mr. Hobsbawm and go to Brian, when he says, a line, he talks about the narrative of vindication. He says, allied narratives of development in beyond a boundary are narratives of vindication in which the colonial subject refutes the challenges, ideas, and practice of domination. And of course, his paper goes on to demonstrate how that narrative of vindication, one of the three narratives which he alludes to, which I think is what I really want to talk about this morning. To begin with, Trinidad and Tobago, as you perhaps well know, rarely has produced quite a number of scholars. I want to pick up on Clem's thing, that James didn't come out of nowhere. There was a tremendous intellectual tradition out of which James came, and he talked about the other dimensions in terms of people like Love and so on. But even within the context of Trinidad and Tobago, there's a tremendous culture that included people like CLR James, Eric Williams, Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, Oliver Cromwell Cox, and I must again, George Padmore's father, Alfonso Nos, taught in the same slave school that we built in Tagarigua in 1837. Same school. Alfonso Nos, James's father, before Nurse changed his name to Padmore. And so, therefore, there's a great, big intellectual tradition out of which James came, and I would not subscribe to that notion there was no tradition. Even James says it's a Naipaul and that nonsense. I don't think it's true. There's a deep intellectual tradition in the Caribbean that goes back, I would say, about certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, 200 years. Against that background, one can argue that when James arrived in London, given the pressures of his time and perhaps the anxieties that he felt in a new land, in spite of his bravado, James sought to underplay the importance of African ideas and West Indian practices that informed his life. In a way, he sought to emphasize his familiarity with English culture and ways of life that would make him more acceptable in the political and social circles of Europe. Reflecting on his high school education at QRC, James had the following to say. He says, "It was only long years after that I understood the limitations on spirit, vision, and self-respect which was imposed upon us by the fact that our masters, our curriculum, our codes of moral, everything which is underlined, began from the basis that Britain was the source of all light and learning, and our business was to admire, wonder, imitate, learn. Our criterion of success was to have succeeded in approaching the distant ideal. To attain it was a course that was very impossible." And he goes on to talk about that whole notion, pages 38, 39, of that notion of the colonial boy or scholar wanting to reach the ideal of the other. And in a way, I think by displaying his acceptance of his knowledge of that other, was able to make his mark in English society. However, once James arrived in London in 1932, he could not be possibly aware of how much he would have to display his knowledge of European literature and culture at the expense of any exploration and knowledge of his own Trinidadian and West Indian culture. However, in Writing Beyond a Boundary, he adopted the autobiographical turn, which allowed him to bring himself to life through graphy or writing, which allowed him to plumb the depths of his being. I think, as Lacan talked about language as being the script of the unconscious. And I think in the sense of James, we could talk about language in this case as being a script of the unconscious, a way so that the autobiographical mode which he uses is not accidental. In fact, it's central to his understanding of his own consciousness and his own self after all of those years. Such processes allowed him to affirm in his preface that all those ideas that we talked about today originated in the Caribbean. In point of fact, it's England that gave him the scope to speak about it, but I think was a sort of self-reflection and trying to arrive and speak to the conscience via the autobiographical mode, through graphy writing as a script, as Lacan says, of the unconscious. James was born in the Tagarigua Tunapunaruka area, a location in the country in which Africans in the society had tremendous influence during the 19th century. Today, we call it the East-West Corridor, where a large slice of the African and African descendant population still lives. We know that most of our African population came to our shores between 1783, the settler population, and 1833, a year before the abolition of slavery. And some, of course, came from Africa, some from America. But of course, at that time, the majority were African peoples who were in fact directly born in Africa. In fact, in that area also, quite a lot of people were brought in by people like Count Lopino running from the Haitian Revolution with their slaves, and people of that area in terms of adding to the revolutionary fire. So it's no accident that Padmore, James, Sylvester Williams would come from that Aruka Tagarigua area, where in point of fact, those sentiments were so alive and being carried on in such important ways. By 1802, when the island was ceded to Britain, about 2/3 of the slave population, of the enslaved population, was African-born. In 1851 census, the 1851 census lists 6,035 native-born Africans, about 7% of the population. But in 1861, few native-born Africans were on the islands. By 1889, J.J. Thomas, to whom we've alluded, lists about 16 different African ethnic groups in Trinidad and Tobago, among them the Yorubas, the Mandingos, etc. So in that specific area, there's a very high concentration of folks who were born in Africa and bring in to a large degree their own culture. In fact, my grandma was a Shango or Risha, etc. When you go to the Palais, you better be reverential in the Palais and don't fold your arms, because there's certain things you did not do. More importantly, though, and I think was alluded by Clem, during the 19th century, many Africans came from Barbados to work in the sugar estates. The older colonies were going down in Guyana and Trinidad, new colonies, and of course the sugar industry has been, and that's what James alludes to, is coming to being, and we need workers and we need technicians. Hence, the pan boiler is the most important thing if you want to get your sugar right, be it the Muscovado process or whatever process, you better get it right because. And they were coming. But the important things about their coming, which I think most people have missed, if I'll take a code from Bobby, they brought two things with them: the Bible and the common book of prayer. Now you say, why is that important? It's through the Bible and the common book of prayer that they got the first rudiments of the word. If you were Catholic, you could not read the Bible because the priests kept the word and had it hidden from the people. So in terms of the Barbadian influence, and I shan't go much into it, the fact here is that they were very important. In fact, Owen Mathurin, in a book on Sylvester Williams, says, and I quote just very briefly, he says, "It was almost legendary that Barbadian parents were always firm with their children, religious church-going, and observant in the Sabbath. First, their children with stories of colored men in Barbados who had risen in spite of the handicap of color in which that society was dominated." That was brought by the Barbadian parents. But most importantly, the common book of prayer and the Bible, via which they, of course, had their first appreciation and understanding the word. Even though primary school education did not become free until 1900. Prior to that, you had to pay to go to school, even at primary school level. And so through their ABCs and so on, and the use of the Bible, they got their language. Without, though, actually noting it, James's Anglicanism, his knowledge of the Bible, and his Barbadian origins were more important in shaping his literary and intellectual life. In An Empire Divided, Andrew O'Shaughnessy notes, and I quote, "Barbados contained the largest proportion of small and midland planters, numbering some 4,000 resident landowners in 1765. It had a better infrastructure with the oldest assembly in the British Caribbean, the first printing press, schools in every parish, the first newspapers, and a well-supported Anglican church." He adds in one of his footnotes, he says, "Barbados alone resisted the attempts to disestablish and disendowed the Anglican Church in the late 19th century by voting a subsidy." These are important intellectual and literary legacies, which is important to understand James. If one, though, and we're talking about the text now and sort of plumbing what I would call the unconscious of the text, or the unsaid of the text, if one listens attentively to the silences in James's text, one would hear, and perhaps that will explain again, Mr. Levis, the silences in the text, which Bobby was alluding to. If one listens attentively to the silence of the text, one would hear these echoes coming through. In a remarkable passage in Beyond a Boundary, James alludes to this influence when he says, and I wouldn't read all of it, but I'd read a bit of it. Again, James conscious and also awareness of this influence. He says, "As I dig long into my memory, I recall that the earliest books I could reach from the windowsill when I had nothing to do, or rain stopped the cricket, or there was no cricket, were biblical. There was a series of large, brightly colored religious pamphlets telling the story of Jacob and the ladder, Ruth and Naomi, and so forth. There was a large book called The Throne of the House of David. One day somebody must have told me, or I may have discovered it from listening to the lessons being read in the church, that the stories could be found in many Bibles that were about the house, including the large one with the family births and deaths. Detective-like, I traced down the origins and must have warmed the souls of my aunts and grandmother as they saw me poring over the Bible. That I had heard often enough was a good book. It fascinated me. When the parson read the lessons, I strove to remember the names and the numbers, second chapter of the second book of Kings, the Gospel according to St. Matthew's and so on, every Sunday morning. Reverend Allen had a fine voice and was a beautiful reader, I would have go home and search and read half true to myself, or half aloud to myself. He says, somewhere along the way, I must have heard the basic rhythms of the English prose in the library. We know, of course, this year is the 400th anniversary of the Common Book of Prayer, etc., etc. But it's there the rhythm of the language, at least part of the inheritance, comes through to James. An important inheritance, I think. I said before, if James's father, if James were Roman Catholic, we would not have had a James. That culture and that religious training did not allow for that. Let's talk a bit, though, about James's father, Robert James. Somebody talked about the mother and Judith, but the father, somehow we black brothers always get left over in the shuffle. Ain't nobody talk about James's father. But it's all right. It's all right. No, I'm just talking about our conference. That's all. I'm just talking about our conference. All right, Sister Love? No, Judith. All right, thank you. Robert James, James's father, also influenced James' life. Apart from his father's cricketing ability, James says, and I quote, he says, my father took the obvious way out, teaching. He did well and gained a place as a student in the government training college. His courses comprised of history, literature, geometry, algebra, and education. Yet Cousin Nancy, who lived a few yards away, told many stories of her early days as a house slave. We go back to slavery again, y'all. Cousin Nancy, she must have been in her 20s when slavery was abolished in 1834. My father got his diploma too and got married. However, it was his father who piloted him through his college exhibition examination, which he won, I think, at the age of 9. He did very well at 8, but 9, he really did the thing. James' father, I'm sitting in that Tagargo, Aruka area. James' father taught at several primary schools throughout the island, including Aruka and Arima government schools, where he enjoyed a brilliant reputation as the head teacher of the institution. Jean Besson, who wrote a book called Reflections of His Age because he's a schoolmate of James, talk about James and his son and the reputation they had. Cyril Austin, that's Robert's nephew, lived in the same house as James, also talked about that important influence. But listen to the mark of the father. As reported in the Mirror, Trinidad newspaper, on April 2nd, 1902. It says, they carry a report of a missionary meeting that took place at the Aruka at the end of the month, and it noted, and I quote, it says, the choir, under Mr. Robert James, here sang the anthem, Praise the Lord, O Jerusalem. The Reverend Dr. Witchy referred to the Arab slave trade in Africa and stated that its last stronghold had been destroyed during Lord Kitchener's Sudan campaign, end of quote. During that period, this is a very important thing for us, the role of debating societies in the country. All over the country, there were debating societies. James's father was a part of those debating societies. In fact, he participated in the association's first debate called, Is the British Occupation of the Transvaal Justifiable? Speaking on behalf of the affirmative, this is what James' father says, again taken from the Mirror. Speaking on behalf of the affirmative, Robert James referred to the compound system and the disgraceful manner in which the English in the Transvaal were treated by the Boers during the war, etc. There's, again, a whole culture of which James is a part, even at the level of the question of his knowledge and his learning and his teaching. So, therefore, from his early school days, James's literary and political path was set. Besso, Jean Besso, a fellow classmate of James, who I think studied here or studied in Edinburgh as to do medicine, captures the CLR James that we would come to know. In his book, Caribbean Reflections, this is what Besso says. He says, I realize how much Nello, a pet name for James, knew because he ought to have been doing it, when he ought to have been doing his homework, he was reading history and literature. That is, in the classroom. I mean, instead of doing his classwork, he would actually be reading. I remember his reading Green's English history, which the ordinary run of students like myself did not read. But he would read the master's textbooks, and he used to read Shakespeare and books which were entirely out of the curriculum. I used to lend him my textbook, and he had to make marginal notes in them. And in later days, when I studied more into English literature, I likened him to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Taylor Coleridge. So it was in those days then that Nellie used to come up to our house, and we used to study by candlelight. We didn't have no lights. Candlelights, pitch oil lights, or lamplight, because in those days there was no electricity, end of quote. So at the end of 18, James knew exactly what he wanted to do. He knew he was going to be a writer, and he talked a lot about his puritanical soul. After James left QRC, he spent almost a decade in Trinidad participating in intellectual, social, and political life of the century. First, he started his own high school, Pavilion High School, and proclaimed and produced his own dramas, including Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Before he came up here, Christian, and did that whole thing on Toussaint, was producing his own plays. He also worked with the Beacon Group and contributed several articles to that magazine. But the important point of James's awareness and consciousness of his own historical and literary background, in one of those numbers in January 1931, he did a whole article on the life of Michel Maxwell Philip, one of the early colored solicitors of the country. Of course, Michel Maxwell Philip produced the very first novel, Emmanuel Apodaca, in Trinidad and Tobago and probably the West Indies in 1854. And it resonates with references to Africa. So James himself, even before he does the life of Captain Cipriani, is plumbing into his own indigenous literary intellectual culture to understand. So it'll be just a matter of course when he goes on to talk about J.J. Thomas and others. He was aware, which I think he silenced when he got here initially, of that culture. And you could read Biana Bangri as a way of going back into that culture to sort of reclaim his career. I will not go through James's publishing history after 32 when he came in because we all know it, etc. Except to argue that in a way, the Black Jacobin, which he did in 38, had come full circle from where Canon Philip Douglin and J.J. Thomas started off in the middle of the 19th century. You want to know about Canon Douglin and you want to know about J.J. Thomas, etc., go to my book, Beyond Boundaries, which I discussed the entire intellectual history of Trinidad and Tobago of the 19th century. I'm arguing that that book goes back and loops around with that in talking about certain kinds of ideas. Douglin is important, and of course, which they all were doing, trying to demonstrate how white racism and colonialism had deformed human relationships. Of course, Douglin was doing it, Thomas was doing it, etc. Who was Douglin, very briefly? Douglin was a Barbadian Anglican pastor, again Anglicanism, who had spent several years in Rio Pongas, West Africa, as a missionary. In fact, he was trained at Codrington in Barbados. And you know what the English were doing in Codrington, training blacks to go back to Africa, to angelize Africans, in fact, because they had the, quote-unquote, the English or the culture, and they were easy able to get there. But Douglin was very important in that. And of course, he returned to Trinidad in 1887, that's Douglin, to take up his pastoral duties at St. Clement's in San Fernando. Thomas, the son of a slave, you know his history, and did the same to us. Thus, even in his greatness and his works, both in Biana Bangri and Black Jacobins, James was continuing a conversation that was started by Michel Maxwell Philip, even Jean-Baptiste Philippe in 1826, writing a Free Mulatto, that of course was taking place long before James came on the scene. He was also following a very powerful piece by Douglin called Emancipation Speech in 1888, long before Fanon, when, of course, Douglin was saying his Emancipation Speech, that slavery is not what happened to your back, it's what happened to your psyche. And, of course, Thomas was doing in terms of the illogic of that colonial project itself. Each of these orders touch on the importance of the question of memory and the African culture in terms of how it shaped West Indians. It seems to me then, if we look carefully at Biana Bangri, one could then argue that Biana Bangri was a work that James had to write to complete his Caribbean Odyssey and to understand who he was. It is true that he notes in his preface to that edition that, quote, to establish his identity, Caliban, after 3 centuries, must himself pioneer into regions that Caesar himself never knew. Quote, end of quote. But in order to understand himself, after 63 years of life, James had to return to his early life to understand what those 60 years meant to him and what those factors of his life, his previous life, meant in terms of his own life. He ends when he talks about in 63, he says, I walked behind my father's hearse with my sister and Judy, etc., etc. And of course, at the time I want to scream, well, what were you doing? He praised them for doing all kinds of work. I said, but James, where were you? They were taking the sister and the brother. He continues, and this is where I will end. He says, in the turmoil around me, he's following his father's hearse, talk about the end of this part of generation. He says, in the turmoil around me, my family fascinated me and as never before. On that spot from which I looked through the windows at Matthew Bondman and Arthur Jones, succeeding generations of the James family had lived in direct descent for 150 years. Of course, they began that descent in 1800. That in the West Indies is a long time, living 100 consecutively for so many years in one place. We were established before the Norman conquest. He says, we are of the West Indies, West Indians. From an ancient citizen, 93 years of age, I learned that my grandfather used to teach in Sunday school. Some members of the family must have helped build the church of the Good Shepherd, as my family helped to build the Anglican Church in Tagarigua, the second oldest church in the island. And he says, this is where, of course, I memorized the chapters and verse of the lessons so as to look them up in the Bible, of which there were many at his home, where the last rites were said for my father. That's what he's thinking about as he sees his father being buried. When he was married in 1900, my great-grandmother presented him with a mahogany table and a wardrobe which had been given to her at a wedding 120 years ago. They're still in use, James says. And then he continues, just 3 lines, he says, but then the supreme realization dawns on James at the time of his father's death. He says, we have traveled, but only the outlines of character are changed. I have changed little. I know that more than ever now. Another part I think you quoted this morning, he says, of course, he now began to realize how much family and how much his situation changed him. And this, I think, is one of the major, or another reading, and one of the major lessons of being a Bangri. James had traveled much. He had seen many places. He had done many things. He had received many accolades for his scholarship. But in the end, only the outlines of his character had changed. He says, I have changed little. It is a story that James had to tell if he wished to challenge the limitations of spirit, vision, and self-respect, which he says British colonialism tried to impose upon Caribbean people through their education, their games, which were not really games, but deadly serious. In order to do so, James had to go back to 150 years, plumb the depths of memory, understand the nature of that consciousness from the inception of his people in that island called Trinidad and Tobago. This is why James said in another context, the longer I live, the more I see that people are shaped to a degree that they do not yet understand by their social relations and family and other groups, end of quote. Karl Marx put it a different kind of way. He says it's not consciousness that determine life, but life itself. But James recognized that in really concrete terms. James was a product of Trinidad and Tobago and Caribbean society. It's a point that we must observe if we ever really wish to understand who and what CLR James was and what he eventually became to all those persons around the world and those here today who have and take so much respect in his life, his work, and his times. I thank you.
I'm a bit uncertain about how to approach what I want to convey to you, because so many thoughts crowd my mind and so many things were said which are contradictory, and which are unfamiliar to me in the sense that it bear no resemblance to the person that I knew and the book that was written. I'm sorry that there is not another person with me, and that's my son Sam, because Sam was trained in cricket by the man he called Jimmy, which was his name in the United States. And Jimmy and Sam would discuss cricket pretty often, pretty regularly, and discuss various merits of the game and who was the all-time team from the whole of history, and couldn't so-and-so really be the captain? And and Nello used to say, yes, Sam, a Hindu can become Pope, but it isn't likely. And that's how they went on with their relationship. And I really would have been glad if he had been able to come. The second thing that I have to say is that whatever CLR said about not changing, ignore it. People say all kinds of things at different moments in their lives. And I saw great changes in CLR's life in the years that I knew him. And those changes are directly relevant to Beyond a Boundary. I want to speak about them and a little something about the book. I've written recently a little article, and some of my ideas are already there. I met James in the United States, and he was the leader of a political organization to which I soon adhered. And I knew him as a man who kept an organization together. And when I heard the cricketer speak earlier today and describe what captaincy was, I recognized many or most of those qualities as what I saw CLR doing, trying to get the best out of his membership. Now that was new. It wasn't, leadership was not new. Leadership is as old as people. But that was new in political organizations, because what CLR did was to reorganize the way Marxists organized. That is, I've written about this, people can find out more about it if it interests them. That is, he became, as Bobby said when he spoke, someone who was interested in the self-mobilization, in the self-organization, in the self-activity of the meanest mariners, renegades and castaways and Matthew Bondmans and Aunt Judith and all kinds of people who have never been acknowledged by political organizations who consider themselves the left. That was important. That was new, and that was something which I think we have not yet appreciated of the work that he has done. Beyond a Boundary is based in that, but it's not based on that, by which I mean it's in the book, it's part of the frame of his mind, but that's not what he's aiming, first of all, to say. When he left the United States and went to England, I joined him a year and a half later when it was legally possible for me to come and to stay for various reasons of international this and that. He was not the same person that I had known in the United States. And then it took me years to understand what was different. In the United States, he was a man of color, a black man. I'm not describing his race, I'm describing his political relation to American society. Okay. When he was in England, he was an anti-colonial. That's different. That means that his relationship to the society was one where he was tied to the state in opposition to it, but tied to the state in another way. And I think, I've been bothered in recent years about something in Beyond a Boundary that I just feel there was something not right about the book. I have a right to be critical of the book. I typed it many times. Before computers, when the author made changes, you retyped. I knew sections of Beyond a Boundary by heart. What someone said yesterday was very important about the fact that CLR had to go to a publisher in England. That was quite crucial. And when Lamming and Naipaul and the others had to go to publishers in England, that did not dictate the nature of their novel. But when he wrote Beyond a Boundary, I feel that had some impact. He had to write for an English audience. And he should have written for an English audience and a West Indian audience, and what bothers me would not have bothered me. There is a way in which it is too directed at the English, and therefore sometimes leaves British imperialism just that little bit off the hook. I feel that in the book, in spite of the fact that I think it's a brilliant book. And I want to say something else about the book. My favorite chapter is the one on Wilton St. Hill. That is the novelist. When you read that, it is a novel. It is the story. It is the essence of the human dilemma. And it is individuals who jump out of the page to you. And I think that's a crucial part of what the strength of the book is and why it transcends boundaries in terms of national boundaries. I think anybody can relate to that chapter on Wilton St. Hill. I think it's wonderful. I think the writing in general is fantastic. And I think that Beyond a Boundary is something else because it's part of a movement. It was published in 1963. It was finished, not in 1961, Bobby. As far as I know, it was finished in 1962, but I may have my dates wrong. So in 1961, CLR was a very sick man, and I can't imagine that. I don't think we did any of the work in the West Indies. I think it was all done when we came back to England. I may be wrong. Beyond a Boundary was part of a movement which began in the late 50s and early 60s. We refer to it as the 60s. We know about that. It was when everything was up for grabs, when people were thinking new thoughts and making new proposals about how we should live, etc. And Bobby referred to Leavis, and Leavis's scrutiny, his precision, was very characteristic of CLR's precision and the concern with technique. But Leavis was a snob. And Leavis and his wife Queenie, whom I've heard speak, they had no understanding that the rest of us could grasp anything, really. But CLR was able to make the connection between what he was doing and how he was doing it with what Levis was doing absolutely right. But at the same time that we were, I say we, of course I didn't write it, but I mean at the same time as he was writing and I was typing, cooking, etc., don't forget that, I want the childcare taken into consideration. There were other things happening which I want to refer to. Other people were finding their way to the kind of perspective and the kind of method and the how of politics that CLR had broken through into. One was a man called Frank Kermode. He was a literary critic, and I don't know much about these things at all, but I always read obituaries, and I get an education in history that I missed up to then. And Frank Kermode said, he said, Kermode himself wrote in the introduction to the latter volume that any literary journalism that was able to satisfy non-specialist interests, quote, without loss of intellectual integrity, unquote, was more demanding than most of what passes for scholarship. Now, that's where CLR was at. The non-specialized audience had to have access to what the specialized audience had found out. That was the job of academia. You would not know it at most of this conference. And that is a complaint that is not mine alone. Many, many people are very upset with how far academia has gone from normal life, from normal struggle, you know, and from our struggle especially for survival, which is where the society we live in has now reached. I want to read something else, and I'm particularly happy to read it with Mike Dibb here and the great BBC film that he made. We've lost a lot. We've lost most of the BBC. It doesn't do what Mike and others used to do, which was to give us an education that we could get nowhere else. This is from the Sunday Times, 20 January 1963. It was a couple of months before Beyond a Boundary was published. And it's about a woman called Grace Wyndham Goldie. I understand she was a Tory, and she had a foul mouth, and she swigged a lot of whiskey, and she was fantastic. She educated a whole group of men, and I think they were all men, to give us the BBC, the broadcasting that was needed. And she was interviewed. I saw this article, and I've kept it in my special cuttings. She was asked about, you know, are you too intellectual for the audience?
That would be grossly impertinent of me, she says. I have a great belief in the intelligence of the audience.
Yes.
When a producer fails with a program and says it was because it was over and the heads of the audience, I tell him it is he who has failed.
That's it. Thank you. If it's over the heads of the audience, then you have failed, not the audience. Okay? That's what Beyond the Boundary is about. Beyond the Boundary says this is the view, this is art, this is politics, this is history, this is literature, and you all can manage that with no trouble at all. I'm going to see that you do. And he wasn't going to fail. And what CLR is clearly saying is that not only is cricket beautiful in the narrow visual sense, but that cricket carries with it so much history, and so much history as it is expressed in physical movement, that it is an art. And I want to tell you one thing that I know will interest you. You know, Baryshnikov was a great 20th century ballet dancer. I'm sure that many of you would know about him. He was just great. He was an amazing dancer. And I read one day that Baryshnikov said, the greatest dancer of the 20th century is Fred Astaire, who was my favorite. You know, you have to, what that means and what the arguments are that CLR is making about art is this. The principles of every art are the same. The way they are expressed is unique in each case, with each artist, with each discipline, but the principles are the same. And that's why CLR thought Mozart and Louis Armstrong had a lot in common. Okay? And Louis Armstrong himself always said there's only two kinds of music, good and bad. And you know, there was a profundity there that you had to acknowledge. Now, we went to the West Indies and were there for some time, and sometimes I'm going to have to talk or do something about it to tell that story. And it was really not the story of West Indian independence. That was settled. That was settled before we came. MacLeod had come and said, hurry up. Yes. Excuse me. You had to have the imperial power come and tell you to hurry up. Well, it's not a struggle, is it? The struggle was for federation. The struggle was to be together. And here I want to make a terribly important point, or at least important to me. There was a lot of talk about West Indian identity. You know, the working class in the West Indies, the grassroots in the West Indies have no problem with identity at all. That's a problem of people who are torn between the intellectual life of Europe and the life of the country they come from, or the area they come from, or the power they have in the society from which they come. But grassroots West Indian people knew who they were, and the one thing they knew was that they should be together. And the politicians, to a man, let them down. And we have to remember that Beyond the Boundary was finished after the great defeat of our lives, CLR and mine. I think my son too, although he was a kid, that we did not get the West Indian Federation, and we knew that the consequences of that were very great. And I think there's a woman, at least one woman in the West Indies, who will say, and that's why the cricket team is in trouble. But I'm not making that case. Okay, I want to say something now about the campaign to make Frank Worrell captain. I didn't do any editing in The Nation except the letters page. I was the assistant to the editor. I was the advertising manager. I was General Dog's buddy. I was a typist. I did all kinds of things, but edit I did not. CLR was the editor. The other person that I have to acknowledge who fought with us for The Nation is a man called Walter Anamontado, who is dead, and who has been neglected, I think, in CLR's history. When CLR was put under house arrest by Dr. Williams, it was Walter that went every day with him to the police station. I have to register that fact because there has not been, you know, the credit where credit is due. Walter was great. Walter was a working class guy. Walter wanted the, pardon? Guyanese, yes. Walter, and a distinguished Guyanese family too. Walter was a man who wanted a labor code in Trinidad and never got it. A good moment was when CLR wanted to make Frank Worrell captain, and he had a newspaper to do it with. It was just extraordinary. You know, it was just a wonderful thing, and we had a fantastically good time doing it. But it was not easy. First of all, the circumstances of Worrell becoming captain at that time were, number one, the elite, especially the brown elite in Jamaica, was entirely against it. I can give evidence of that for anyone who wants it. They thought that Alexander should stay. And the second thing was, at the same time as the campaign for Worrell to be captain was going on, Eric Williams was making a deal with the Americans about the American base in Chaguaramas, which had been a subject of the campaign, of a popular campaign among the people. And so many people were starting to say that CLR took it upon himself to make Frank Worrell the captain and hadn't consulted with the P&M before he did it. Let's remember that. So that when he won, you know, they were deeply embarrassed. And when Eric Williams, who was about to shaft us, announced that CLR James had taken upon himself for Frank Worrell to be captain, the first black captain of the West Indies, there was such a burst of applause that he never finished the sentence. And all those who had been attacking James precisely for doing the campaign shut up. It was a pleasure. And it was a great honor that we saw the man who really deserved to be captain of the West Indies to take his proper place and to do a brilliant job of captaining, and for everyone in the team talking about Skipper like he was God on a bicycle. They loved Frank Worrell. They all loved Frank Worrell. And you know, that demonstration in Australia was terribly important. I wanted to say just a couple of other things. In the discussions that took place yesterday and today, and presentations, there was a phrase, what was the name of it? Coloniality, I remember now. Well, you know, coloniality is just another word for saying colonialism, only it's uniquely understandable by nobody. If you want to know, if there's a text in the West Indian body of literature that you want to read about identity, I have a recommendation. George Lamming wrote a book called Season of Adventure, and 2/3 through, he stops the novel. Do people know that book?
Yep.
Not too many. I'm not seeing dozens of hands. Read it. It's really something special. 2/3 of the book, he stops and he says, I have an author's note. In other words, there's something I have to tell the reader about what I've been writing. And he says how the man who in the novel is a murderer is really his brother. And that his brother and he were divided by education. And he has never felt himself an honest part of anything since the world of his childhood deserted me. That's a quote. And he says, I will not have the blame placed, I'm not quoting, on a foreign conscience labeled imperialist. I am responsible for what happened to my brother. Now, that's a really profound statement of people who are putting colonialism behind them. That's not the problem anymore. The problem is, how are those who have got the education going to relate to those who are deprived? You know, and I don't think we should go to others who talk abstractly about identity. We should go to those who know what the real story is. And Lamming, whether or not in fiction, has given us an important statement. Nobody has referred in this conference to CLR's brother, not his sister either, but his sister was just a great woman to whom I will be eternally grateful in really helping me to understand the man I was married to. But Eric was a manager of football. And when the two brothers used to get together, you know, Nello, who had a lot to say for himself, was completely quiet, and Eric would tell him every single game he had been involved in and all the things that had happened, and Nello would sit there absolutely fascinated by what his brother had to say. He was a very good listener, and he was very anxious to know not only what people did, but how they did it, how they managed, how they organized, how they related to each other, how they discovered things, how. Now, you know, as he got older, I do agree, he appreciated the background from which he came, and he used that. But the important thing about CLR, and that will remain, is that he was truly an internationalist person who believed in human liberation and who was absolutely determined to give everything to that, you know, to be completely immersed and never to be bothered about two things: whether he made money, that was a bit of a crisis, or whether people liked what he was saying or doing. He did it. And I think if we want to use CLR, as we must, you know, we have to begin with that. He was going to do it whether the state liked it or not, and I liked it. Thank you.
Could you just go a bit more into what CLR's criticism and real problem with Williams was around Shaka Ramos, and kind of what was Williams saying back, if anything? Because you know, what I've seen in the archives, you have a bunch of stuff where Nello's writing him, saying he's made this and that mistake, but you never see anything back from Williams to CLR James. And so I'm just wondering, what was that interaction? What was Eric Williams saying back? And also, that when you talked about, you know, he said CLR James took it upon himself to get world captain. What was the rest of the sentence that he didn't get to finish? I'm just wondering.
The rest of the sentence, which is found in party politics in the West Indies, you know, all I heard that day was if CLR James took it upon himself to make Frank Worrell the first black captain, and then the place exploded. Later, you know, the script was released, and he said, then everybody will know that PNM will get the credit.
Yep.
Of course not. PNM never did nothing for it.
Yep.
Not only that, PNM had stood against it, and just as he was saying that, had just made a deal with the Americans. So. The relationship between, I'd like to say something about that. There isn't a lot of time, so I'll be very brief. Night after night, Williams would come to the house, his brother would drive him. He'd come after work when it was time to go to sleep at 11 o'clock or midnight, and he would say, Cyril, there are some problems. And Cyril was CLR. And he would relate the problems, and Nello would say, Bill, look, I think that you should do this and this and this, and why do you bother with that? Leave that and do that. And they would speak for about an hour, or they would go into the bedroom and speak for about an hour, so that was a private discussion. And Bill Williams would go and do what Nello said. That happened night after night. Then it didn't happen. And he accused CLR of stealing. It's such a bad story. You don't want to end a conference like that.
This question is directed to Mrs. James. It's prompted by your statement, which read, in 1961, CLR James was a very sick man. I don't know if I got it correct. And I understand the context there is a vehicular accident in Jamaica in late April. But I am still seeing letters from CLR James in 1961 after the accident. And what I want to ask is, did you type these letters? Or was it James?
James didn't know how to type. And James had a very serious hand tremor where he would not have been able to type. I would have typed them. Why do you ask?
Because in reading the letters, there's some assumption that he did it. So there's some false attribution there.
No,
so I needed to know, who the typo was.
It took him.
He dictated the letters.
Oh yes.
Okay,
he often
thanks.
dictated it.
Thanks very much.
He either dictated, or he wrote them, and I copy typed.
Okay, thank you. The second question, Nello, how that came about, that
Because
name?
his mother was reading a novel about a Count Leonello when she was pregnant with him, and that's why. And then his nephew became Nello, and his other nephew became Henno. So it was Henno and Nello, it's just in the family.
Just on the question of typing, I think I want to congratulate you on a wonderful, wonderful final address, but also to tell everybody that you are probably the fastest typer in the universe. And actually, I first knew you because you typed transcripts of the BBC in order to make money. And being a woman of extremely eloquent opinion, what was wonderful is the transcripts always came back with Selma's thoughts about the content of the interviews I'd done, saying, don't use this, rubbish, this is interesting. So she was the first editor of anything I did. And I knew Selma before I realized that the James meant that she was married to CLR. And just another little memory in terms of actually the way he was interested in what everybody thought. When we were filming in Manchester, he stayed in a hotel and I had to go in and wake him. And he was sitting up in bed with a pile of women's magazines, which were, and he was, I thought that wasn't the most likely reading matter. He said, no. All you have to know all the time is what people are interested in, what they are thinking, what they are feeling. So if I'm reading these magazines, I'm learning something.
CLR was he was extraordinary. He was extraordinarily interested in many things and could connect them. He saw the connections between them. That's what was his great strength. But he was a very different person when he was part of an organization. And do not doubt, and do not allow his genius to make you doubt, that he was a great deal more profound, and a great deal even simpler and more direct as a result of being part of an organization which was accountable to each other and which was not a dictatorship on any level. He had a leadership with him who were, first of all, two women, and that didn't do him any harm. One was Russian, and the other was Chinese, and he was West Indian, as you know. And the leadership of our organization was, by its very nature, international, multi-gender, and multiracial. And that did us, none of us, any harm at all.
Yeah, I want to just take a principled disagreement with you on one point.
Good.
When James himself says, I didn't change much, you said, ignore it.
Yes.
The first thing is, I don't accept any sort of privileged reading of text, in the sense that you may have typed the text, you did not write the text.
Indeed.
And any writing of a text, a writer is trying to work through his own problematics. That's point one. Point two, you met James at the age of 38, because when he got the States, I don't know what time he's been 38.
Oh.
James goes to the States in 38, with no what?
I didn't meet him.
I don't know when you meet him, but I'm saying it has to be later than that. I don't know the date, so I'm giving the date. He had to be at least 38.
Yeah.
James is making a statement. He speaks of himself at the age of 63, having lived 2/3 of his life. And he makes a statement as he wishes to represent himself, and you say, ignore it. Unfortunately, I cannot agree with that. I don't think because you typed the text and wrote the text that you have some privileged information that we must ignore 63 years of life, because with all due respect, you understand the turn of the times. But I think one has to be less dogmatic about that, because I think that it's difficult for me if I'm reading the text and this gentleman is saying that and you're saying, ignore it, who must I believe? So I would be a little careful about that. I prefer not to ignore James and what he says. And I prefer to let him represent himself with all of the nuances that autobiographical statement allows, and more importantly, that a text is not simply words on a paper. A text is someone trying to represent. I started by talking Jacques Lacan. The person who follows Freud in psychoanalytic theory argues that writing is a script of the unconscious. You're trying to work through your own problematics. And with all due respect, I don't think that that is the last word because you've typed it. So I would disagree on that, and I just want to put that in the record.
I'm ready to say don't ignore it, but I'm not ready to agree that that's the case.
Well, no, but at least we're closer, but you can't say ignore it. I want to make sure. So we have agreement there, but I want to put that on the record. Yes, thank you.
Brian Oline from Goldsmiths. I wanted to ask a question, Selma. I fear it may be too late in the day, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I recall it might have been you were speaking with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!
Oh, yes.
And you talked about CLR helping you get started as a writer. And there's a wonderful story about writing things down on bits of paper and putting them into a shoebox. And I wondered if you could say a few words about how you learned to become a writer in the context of being a political activist, and if there are any insights into how CLR himself worked as a writer.
Well, I don't think of myself as a writer. I do write, but that's not, I write because there's something I want to do politically. Otherwise, I don't write. But the story you're referring to, I'll be very brief because our time is short. He had proposed that I do a pamphlet on women because we had had a conversation where he was quite blown away by my description of my neighbors and a political analysis of the community in which I lived, the working class community of which I was part. And he called me some months later and said, have you written the pamphlet? He was in Los Angeles, so it wasn't difficult, it wasn't expensive to call. And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't know how to write a pamphlet. I was 21, and I had had a high school diploma, but I hadn't had any further education, so there was no reason that I would be writing. And he said, it's very simple. He said, you take a shoebox, and every time you have a thought, you put it on a piece of paper, and you slip it into the shoebox. then one day you open the shoebox and you put all the pieces of the paper together and you'll have a pamphlet.
Makes sense.
I said, okay. And I did that. And one day, instead of going to work, I was working in a radio factory on the assembly line. I dropped my child at the childminder, or the nursery, and then I went to a friend, previously arranged, and spent the day there, so I couldn't do any housework when at home. I had no connection with the house except the box, okay, which I brought. And I opened the box and I put the pieces of paper together and I typed the sequence, and by 7 o'clock that night I had a draft of a pamphlet. There were various problems which I describe in the book, but it was it was a pamphlet, and it was republished since then, when the women's movement began. It's been published in a number of languages and various editions, etc. And everybody agrees that A Woman's Place, which was the title given by my friend, is a good pamphlet and a good picture of working class life from women's point of view. Now, I didn't know then, but I do know now, after CLR and I were together almost 30 years, I do know that he worked out constantly how to help grassroots people to get their views and their sentiments across, in words, but also he was a very good organizer to make proposals about the thing that you did next, and if you said, well, if anybody said, there's nothing that can be done, he would say, there is always something that can be done. Something like that. I was an imitation. And we have, I do have to say this, we have in the Global Women's Strike, worked on the principles that CLR established organizationally. They're not the same at all as they were when he put them forward. Life moves on. You're not going to do the same thing with women and men and children in 2013 that was proposed in 1951. That's the left. But we're not the left. We're a bit more updated. And I find that his principles are impeccable, that his principles, I try to tell people about them, I try to speak about them, I try to describe how he approached politics, how he approached life. And, I think they're very good, and I don't think that people pay attention to them because they are taken by his ideas, especially his cultural ideas. But when he was in southeast Missouri, the man, I can't remember his name, maybe Bobby will, he has such a fantastic memory. Booker, was it Booker, said, Mr. Johnson, which was the name he was going on by, we need a pamphlet. He said, this is how he told me, he said, all right. And he got paper and pen together and he sat down and he said, what shall I say? Booker wasn't expecting that. He wanted Mr. Johnson, a pretty literate guy, to write the thing, but he wouldn't. He said, what do you want to say? And the guy told him what he once said. Now, I read that, as it happens, a few weeks ago, and it's perfectly clear that it has CLR's stamp on it. There are a couple of little phrases he added. Oh, yes, he did. But fundamentally, it was Booker, and it was a fantastic piece of propaganda for organizing, and just to speak to the white workers to get them on your side, and to speak to the black workers to get them, to be together in solidarity. It was a beautiful piece of work. And that's not what people look at. That's not what people concentrate on. And that's what CLR is absolutely a master of. And that's what he has to contribute to this moment in time when we are fighting for survival. You know, the way he was proposing to deal with people who want to make the change and who know that the life of the world, the life of the human race depends on we getting together, you know, you can learn from him. And I do seriously recommend that you study him from that point of view, and it wouldn't do academia any harm to be practical.